Alright, what's happening everyone? Today in the video, as you can see, we are going to be discussing minimum defense frequency, what the math behind it looks like, what it means, etc. And then also I will show kind of a hand example that was submitted by someone in my Discord that I think kind of exemplifies how maybe some regs or players are misapplying the concept of the minimum defense frequency, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So first off, what is minimum defense frequency? This is the calculation that gives us our bluff catching frequency so that we can't be exploited by a perfectly balanced opponent. So what this does is we know after we've done the math, we know that we have to bluff catch this amount or this percent so that our opponent's bluffs aren't profitable against us. So that's what the minimum defense frequency tells us. So let's look at some simple math. And in the situation that I'm going to be looking at, I'm only looking at the river, and I'm only looking at situations where the range that they're betting is clear bluffs or clear value, meaning that the value bets will always win when we call, and the bluffs will always lose when we call. The calculations change just a little bit when some of our opponent's value bets will actually lose to parts of our calling range, and also when our calling range might accidentally lose to some of his bluffs. For example, if they're bluffing a really small pocket pair and we're making a hero call with ace high or something like that. So we're looking at the most simple ideal situation just to get an idea at this for today. But I think it's still definitely worth, if it's not something you've ever looked at before, it's definitely worth taking a few minutes to watch this video. So in the example here, the math that we're using, our opponent has bet pot on the river, and so this means he's risking one pot size bet to win one pot. So he's giving himself 1-to-1 odds. In this case, if you've watched my math video, you know how to turn the odds into a percent to know how often his bluffs need to win to at least break even. And if you've done the math, you would know that his bluffs need 50% folds in order to break even. And sometimes people will call this number alpha. So another term for the minimum defense frequency that you might hear is 1 minus alpha. So we need to bluff catch at 1 minus this alpha in order to make sure his bluffs don't make a profit. And so this is going to be our minimum defense frequency. And I'm sure you guys have already done the math, but this is a very simplistic version, but sometimes you get some, let's say you get a 30% folds or 34% folds or something like that. It's not immediately obvious what the minimum defense frequency should be, but if it's not immediately obvious, then you can just do this 1 minus alpha calculation, and in this case we know that we need to bluff catch 50% of the time. And this is the math. This is how you do it for anytime you're on the river in this situation that I'm talking about, where they're betting a perfectly balanced polarized range. This is how you find that minimum defense frequency. So another thing that we need to be concerned with, because we're talking about our opponent betting a perfectly balanced range, is what is his optimal bluffing frequency. And in order to calculate our bluffing frequency, we need to look at the odds we are giving our opponent. So in the previous example, we bet pot. This means our opponent is getting 2-to-1. And this ratio here is going to be our exact ratio of value bets to bluffs. And just as a reminder, our bluffs will always be less than the value bets on the river. We're never bluffing more than we're value betting, unless we're doing some sort of crazy exploit. So in this case, we should have 2 value bets, and for every 2 value bets, we get to bluff 1 time. And this is the optimal bluffing frequency in that perfectly polarized situation. So just like I said, for every 2 value bets, we can make 1 bluff if we want to be perfectly balanced. So before I get into the hand example, I'm going to actually look in CREV and just kind of highlight some of those concepts that I just talked about. And this is a very, very simple kind of analysis for this, just to show the point. So we have a range of aces and twos, and for the opponent, and our bluff catching range is kings. So you can just imagine some sort of full range if you want to, but I think this makes the point. So the first thing we can see here is that I have him bluffing with 100% of his aces, 100% of his twos, and because of that, our kings are showing a profit, which if our kings are truly just a bluff catcher, that shouldn't be the case. So if we're trying to be perfectly balanced, we're going to have to go over here and fix this range a little bit. And we do that by the math that we shown before. Because we're betting pot here, you can see the pot is 1, we're betting 1, so we're betting pot, just like we did before. For every 2 value bets, we can have 1 bluff. So we have to make this number half. And watch what happens when we're betting perfectly optimal. Boom, our EV starts jumping up, and we also reduce the EV of the caller. In this case, they're calling too much, because we learned that for our minimum defense frequency, if they're betting pot and betting a perfectly balanced range, then our minimum defense frequency is 50%, and we're calling 100. So we're making a slight mistake here. So we take this down. And our number didn't change, but what happened was, I guess before I show this, the EVs will roughly stay the same, but what happened was here, the bluffs are very negative because we're calling too much. And if that's the case, if we're always calling with our bluff catchers, our opponents are incentivized to never bluff. And so this is why we bluff at the optimal frequency, so that our opponents still have some incentive to bluff, but they can't make money with those bluffs. And so now you'll see when we're betting 50%, we've moved him down to 0. He's incentivized to have those bluffs so that our kings can still make a little bit of money because we're picking up those bluffs. And in this case, no one is exploitable there. Everyone's perfectly balanced. So hopefully this kind of illustrates that point a little bit. You know, you can see here that obviously when you have that perfectly balanced range, you can increase your EV and you can decrease your opponent's EV. There's nothing they can do when all they have is a bluff catcher. The other thing I wanted to show, and I want you guys to just think about this for a second while we're here, is what happens, what should we do if our opponents are under bluffing, even by 1%? So they're not balanced, they're not bluffing optimally. Take a second to think about what you think you should do, how much this number should change in that scenario. And so while you're thinking about that, I'm going to go ahead and run this at 49% instead of 50, so he's under bluffing. And hopefully you've come up with a number. And what you can see here is once he starts under bluffing, our bluff catchers all become negative EV. So what that means is that we should never call, even if it's a slight amount of under bluffing. If he's not balanced, we should never call with a bluff catcher. We should only be calling with hands that can beat some of his value bets. On the flip side, if he's over bluffing by even 1%, we should never fold any of our bluff catchers. So if we go to 51% here, now we're starting to make a profit with all of our bluff catchers, so we should never fold them. So small adjustments out of balance can lead to massive exploits on the other end, as you can see here. So although this isn't the main point of the video, I would say if you notice someone is definitely on the tighter side, really can't find the bluffs in his range, then we should just never bluff catch. Only call when you can beat their bluffs, and if they start to get more aggressive against you, then you can start to bluff catch a little bit more. But it's a very, very big exploit that you can do, at least for a little while, on both sides, whether you're always calling with your bluff catchers or always folding your bluff catchers. So hopefully that makes sense. So if you guys have any questions, you can, as always, leave them in the Discord, leave them in the comments of the YouTube, and I'll definitely do my best to get back to you and try to give you a bit of a better answer. But for now, we're going to go back to the hand example and talk about a few more things. Okay, so I have to apologize that this isn't the cleanest, prettiest hand history. It's just going to be kind of a text wall here, so hopefully you guys can bear with me in this case. But let's say we're in the small blind with ace king, and button opens to 2.5 big blinds, and we make it 7.5, and the button calls, and we're over 100 big blinds deep. You know, maybe 120 or somewhere around there. The flop, it comes king 9-3. We're pretty ecstatic about our hand, and we decide to bet 9.5 into a pot of 16, and the button calls, so now the pot's 35. On the turn, we bet another pretty big sizing into the 35 pot, and he calls, so now it's 79. And on the river, because of we have over 100 big blinds, we've got exactly one pot size bet left, and we decide to bet half pot, and the villain shoves. So what do we do? And if you guys want to spend a second thinking about your thought process of the hand, why you're doing what you're doing, whether you're calling or folding, that's great. You can pause the video and do that, but I'm going to go ahead and go on now. So just a couple notes for this hand. After he jams, if you want to do the math yourself, you could check this, but we're getting 5-1. So we need 16.7% equity to call. So really, he doesn't need that many bluffs, and we need to be calling. But and also, our opponent is risking 1 to win 1.5, so alpha is 0.4, which means that we should be defending with 60% of our range if we take 1 minus the alpha. And so those are a little bit of the numbers that we talked about before. So the first thing I want to talk about is some common arguments that you'll see for calling. The first one is I'm getting too good of a price. As I shown before, we only need 16.7% equity. And so a lot of people just say the price is too good, don't think about it beyond that, and call. Another thing that we'll commonly hear is I'm at the top of my range, and if I fold, I will be getting exploited. And this top of my range argument came from a lot of people studying minimum defense frequency and realizing that if they're facing a bet, if our opponent can bluff, we need to call with X% of hands. And a lot of times what they just do is look down, I'm at the top of my range, and I can't fold or I get exploited. And I kind of showed a little bit before where if they're under bluffing, that this kind of argument, if the top of your range is just a bluff catcher, then this argument becomes pretty invalid. So, you know, as I'm kind of already hinting at, are these true? And the answer is no, these are not good arguments for calling. I'm getting too good of a price is only half the picture. The price has nothing to do, is not taking into account at all our opponent's range. And so if that's the case, and we're not taking that into account, we don't know if we're getting a good price or not. Because again, like I showed, if our opponent is under bluffing, the price doesn't matter. We should be folding 100% of our bluff catchers every time. So just saying the price is too good and not even thinking about the opponent's range is a very, very bad argument for calling. And I'm at the top of my range. If I fold, I'll be getting exploited. That is a very similar, argument using, instead of price, you're using the minimum defense frequency argument. And still, this isn't taking into account the action that happened up to this point, what the opponent's range looks like. And also, a lot of times people actually don't even really recognize whether or not they're actually at the top of their range or not. It's kind of hard to say, if I need to call with the top 60% of my range, what hands fall into that? It's sometimes can be pretty hard. So you need to actually be sure, if you're saying I'm at the top of my range, that you really are at the top of your range. And the first thing I want to do in this case, to kind of highlight that, another example, just real quickly, without even doing anything over here, we can kind of see, let's say this is our value betting range, and we're getting to the river and we're value betting these at equal frequencies. Somehow, these are what we had. We can pretty easily see that on this board, everything that we're betting, other than ace-king, is either an overpair at the absolute worst, or two pair or better. And so this means that of our value betting range that is now becoming a bluff catcher, ace king is actually at the absolute worst end of the range. So we're at ace king is actually the bottom of our range. And if you want to illustrate that a little bit more, if you look at, so we need to call with 60% of our range, like I said, which means that there would be 40% left over. And you can see that ace king only makes up 27.9, which means that we're getting well above 60% of our calling range without even dipping into the ace king. And I guess our straights aren't really bluff catchers, they're the nuts. So we probably need to dip down a little bit more. This will be a situation where, again, the numbers skew a little bit because part of our calling range will beat part of his value betting range. But you can still see here that, we're looking at the very, very bottom of our range, and this isn't something that, unless our opponents are over bluffing, that we really need to dip down into here with something like the ace king. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, and I want to give some better arguments for thinking about defending. So the first one is my range protected by a bunch of hands nobody expects me to fold. So in this situation, in this hand example, we 3-bet pre-flop, which means we have all the kings, the ace kings that people probably don't expect us to fold. We have probably the pocket nines that were on the flop. We have the jack tens that are a pretty easy c-bet on the board. Even a lot of people will c-bet queens. And then we bet big on the turn. So we've repped a strong range throughout this hand, and we're getting a really good price. So not only do we rep a strong range, but this is a situation where, because the price is so good, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that there's a lot of hands in our range that nobody expects us to fold. And if you can answer yes to this question, if our range is really protected and nobody expects us to fold a lot of that range, then this is generally going to lead to under bluffing. The next question you want to be asking yourself is my opponent getting to the river with a wide range of hands where it's easy to find bluffs? And going back to this example, we 3-bet pre-flop, which narrowed his range. We had a pretty decent bet sizing on the flop, over half pot, 9.5 into 16, which is going to narrow his range. He doesn't have all those really wide floats that you might see versus the 1/3 pot sizing. We bet about 2/3 on the turn, which is really going to narrow the range. And yeah, we are, betting maybe a sizing that looks a little bit weak on the river, but we've still shown so much strength up to that point and made it so hard for him to get to the river with a really wide range, especially when you look at the board texture, it being rainbow and only really having a couple gut shots on the flop, that it's not going to be very easy for our opponent to find bluffs. And in this case, if they're not getting to the river with a wide range, either because there was a lot of, maybe potential gut shots or backdoor draws, things like that could have called on the turn, that turned a flush draw that got there, those pretty obvious situations where the range could be wide, or the situation where there was a check on one street, or in a single race pot, a lot of different situations where ranges are much wider. So if you can answer no to this question, again, that generally leads to underbluffing. And so if you go through these two questions and you can say yes to the first one and no to the second one, I would recommend never, ever, ever bluff catching unless you're against the most maniacal of opponents. But again, if you're against the most maniacal opponents, you probably wouldn't be answering yes and no here, because they might just not even be thinking about whether you're folding or not, and they can just show up with any two cards, so the ranges get much wider. So if you answered no and yes to these questions, one thing that you want to think about is help you decide that top X% of your range, whether you're actually at the top of your range or not. Does my hand block their value range? If you have a hand that kind of pairs with a lot of their value range and actually makes it a little bit harder to have some of those hands that they're repping, that's a plus for you. And at the same time, if your hand unblocks their bluffing range, that's another big plus for you. Sometimes parts of their bluffing range will be hands that kind of mimic the value range, so sometimes you can't always get the best of both worlds. But these are things you want to think about, and if you have hands that can say yes to both of these questions, then when you're trying to find your best bluff catchers, then if you've already answered no here and you've answered yes here, and you can say yes to both of these, and you have an amazing bluff catcher, really, really easy situation to find the bluff catch. One common example of why you want to ask this question is, let's say the board is 10 high in a situation where they can have pocket tens as part of their range, and we're faced in a situation on the river and we have either ace 10 or jacks. And the one thing I would say is, if pocket tens is part of their value betting range, then actually ace 10 is going to be a much better call than pocket jacks. As far as absolute value strength, the hands are pretty similar. Jacks might look better because it's an overpair to the board, but when you look at these questions and when you look at your bluff catchers in this way, you're blocking part of their value range by blocking the pocket tens, and you're not really blocking any of their bluffing range. People don't tend to put a lot of ace-x into their bluffing range, whereas something like jacks, you might block a hand like queen jack or king jack or jack nine, or depending on what the board is, if there's any back doors or gut shots that come in there. So jacks actually would block some of their bluffing range, whereas ace 10 tends to unblock quite a bit more of it. So that's kind of an example where just looking at the absolute strength of your hand doesn't give you the whole picture, and why you want to spend some time looking at these questions. So that's going to be it for the video, or at least the PowerPoint portion of the video. I actually wanted to just real quickly look at Pile Solver and just kind of, so this is the situation of the hand, and we get to the river here with whatever our range is. I'm not going to use this for a hand analysis for all the previous streets. And you can see that actually Pile does want us to be betting half pot the majority of the time. And one of the things that you can see here is that when you look at the bluffing range, is they're having to find a lot of bluffs from their king tens and their queen tens. And one of the things that I think is very uncommon is people turning a hand like king 10 into a bluff in this type of a situation. And so already when you're seeing some things in Pile that are just very uncommon in the population pool, that's already a big indicator that players are going to be under bluffing, on top of all the questions that I had you go through before, looking at Pile to see what the bluffing range actually has to look like, and finding hands like this that are just really, really hard to find as bluffs. Just another key indicator that this is going to be a situation that's just going to be under bluffed big time, and we just shouldn't be making those calls with the ace king. And you can see here, they're finding a sliver of bluffs with queen jack, and then doing a decent amount of bluffing with the queen tens. I think, there's definitely players out there that make this bluff maybe a little bit more often, but still it's kind of hard in this situation where there's already so much money in the pot, and it's going to be tough to expect folds. So anyways, if we do jam, if everything was played out perfectly up to this point, given the bet sizings that we had, you could see that Pio is actually starting to even fold some of the ace kings, even against a perfectly balanced range. So we can definitely see here that this is kind of a pretty bad situation for us. Even aces are doing even worse, because ace king will actually block some of his value range, like we talked about before, where we're blocking the king queens and the king nines that are going to be value jamming. So aces is doing even worse, as we could expect. And so in this situation, we should just be folding a lot of these hands that actually look pretty darn strong, is what I'm going to say. And you can see here, so I made this, in order to run it in Pile, we had to make this a 5-10 hand, which means that even in a perfectly balanced scenario, when we're looking at a $2,000 pot, ace king is only giving us 0.86 big blinds, or $8.6. So not even a really, you're not even happy to make the call in a perfect situation. So just wanted to illustrate that here with Pile Solver. And that is going to wrap up the video officially. I appreciate you guys watching. Again, Any comments, questions, concerns, please hit up the Discord or leave the comments below in the YouTube, and I'll definitely get back to you. Good luck at the tables, guys, and take it easy.